Okay, this is one of 8 presentations this week. So Pearson is putting on these webinars about teenage teaching and learning, teaching teenagers and how they learn. And this is one of 8 presentations. I'm giving another one on Saturday. Saturday afternoon, the same time as this one. If you can join us, there will be another presentation. And that one, I'll try to summarize some of the ideas over the entire week and talk about the idea of interactivity. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're saying interactivity. No, I hate computers. Actually, I'm going to make it much broader. I'm going to talk about the interactivity between teachers and students, between students and other students, and of course, also go on to the interactivity between students and technology. There's a famous saying around now. I'm sure you've heard it, but it's saying, technology will not replace teachers, but teachers who know technology will replace teachers who do not. So it's something to think about. Okay, so let's begin. So just in terms of the webinar etiquette, there's some notes here. You should have received this in an email, but if you're having any problems, you can type into the chat message, and Nikki or Rachel will try to help you with some of those problems that you have. Sometimes your connection might be broken. Just dial in again, and remember, you can get the video afterwards if you'd like to see that. Okay, so let's start. Let's get into the main meat of the presentation. Okay, we're talking about working with the teenage brain. And you say, what's different? What's different with the teenage brain? How is that different than young kids or adults? Well, it turns out that the teenage brain is quite a bit different. And I think if you have teenagers yourself, you probably know exactly what I mean. So we're going to talk about some of these ideas. While I talk about these ideas, I'm going to talk about 2 sort of general ideas. One is to do with a textbook, and I'm going to use examples from this particular textbook called Wider World. Now, I didn't write this textbook. I don't get paid for marketing the textbook or anything else. It's by Bob Hastings and Stuart McKinley. But what's interesting is I'm a professor of curriculum development. So that's part of my deep interest, and it was the topic of my PhD. So when I talk about something like this, or I'm asked to talk about something like this, of course, first I have to look at the materials and say to myself, is this something I agree with? Or, does this fit with my understanding? And I'm very pleased to say that it does. It does a lot of great things, which are encapsulated by Pearson's ideas about 21st century learning. So those talk about the different skills that students need now that maybe they didn't need 30 or 50 years ago. The content has to be new and suitable to today's world. The context of learning, just even the way it's taking place, is completely different now than what it used to be. For example, we have ideas like the flipped classroom. The flipped classroom, in which students are encouraged to do more of their work outside of class and really bring their questions to class rather than use it as a place for their principal learning. And finally, there are the tools, and those are things like the computer, but also things like the mobile telephone, which is such a rich device for learning, and it's something that I'm going to be talking more about on Saturday at the same time. So let's move on. Before we start, I want to just briefly go through 7 issues, and then I'm going to touch on them as we go through this presentation. But I just wanted to hit on them very, very briefly first before we get into the 10 ideas about the teenage brain. So the first one is culture, then first language, and how does that make a difference? Maturity of students, the aptitude or the interest in learning or the ability to learn, intelligence, learning styles, and finally, autonomy, the idea of working on your own. Let's look at each of these very briefly before we get on to the teenage brain. The first one is about culture. And we've got big questions about what do we teach about culture. And I'd like to say that I think we have to go in 2 directions here. two directions. The first direction is we have to, of course, introduce students to new culture, and especially the target English language culture. So the wider world focuses mostly, but not totally, on British English and British customs and culture and history and background. But of course, it also has some materials on American and other countries as well. But students, I was saying, have to go in both directions. And the one direction is to be able to understand British culture, but also they have to back up and they also have to understand their own culture. And they have to be able to talk about their own culture in English. Because when somebody from France or from the Ukraine or anywhere, they go to a place like London or New York, nobody's going to say, oh, you're from the Ukraine. Can you tell me about Big Ben? Or are they going to say, oh, can you tell me about the Statue of Liberty? No, they're going to ask about things in your own country. And students should be able to talk about the history, the food, the culture in general. Who are the famous people? Who are the musicians? And things like that. The second point has to do with first language. So we need to consider what makes it more or less difficult to learn English, and how can we predict, identify, and remediate typical learner errors. Now, learners are always making little mistakes, and we have to think to ourselves, okay, so what are typical ones that they're going to make? I've just come back actually from a month in Latin America, and there's certain mistakes that they always make. So, for example, a common one is mistaking he and she. Just that pronoun. I don't know why it's such a problem, but somebody will say something, oh, you have to meet my wife. He's wonderful. He? Is your wife a man? Okay, so I know the problem, and I can predict that. And because I can predict that, I can help that. With Spanish students, we have the difference between the adjective and the noun order. So we're going to say Casablanca or house white in Spanish instead of white house in English. So we can predict those things, and that can help us prepare. The third one has to do with maturity. So how do we deal with learners who are at different maturity levels? And usually this has to do with the idea of, are they ready to engage in learning? Or are they more concerned about, maybe fooling around in class or not paying attention or not engaging? Often this has to do with motivation, and that's an issue we'll talk about in the coming parts of the lecture today. But we also have to remember that age does not equal maturity. Just because you're older doesn't mean you're more mature. And I'm sure many of you have children or nieces or nephews or maybe just 5 years old, but who seem like adults. And that can happen as well. Okay, so the fourth one has to do with aptitude, or how do we explain or identify and expand on students' aptitude. Now, aptitude is really made up of different things. It's your general ability to learn a new language, but that's related to your skills. But it's also related to your attitude. And if we just say, oh yes, he's a good language learner, and not looking at those other things, sometimes we forget that it has to do with attitude and skills. Sometimes if someone doesn't seem to have a great aptitude for learning, maybe what we can do is change their attitude. Maybe we can improve their skills. Maybe that can help us far more than anything else. So we can think about that. Okay, the fifth one is learning styles, and I'm just going to show you this very briefly to make a point. And if we were all together in the same room, I would do this as a little workshop. I've done it many times. But what we can do is we can try and experiment about learning styles. Now, most people say they're either a visual or maybe an auditory learner, or they learn kinesthetically by doing things. There's different attitudes around learning styles, but you can try and experiment. Don't take my word for it. Try this yourself. Ask your students or even some other teachers to say where they are mostly visual learners or auditory learners who learn by hearing. Then ask them to read 10 5-syllable words for just 1 minute. So show them those words, and then remove the words and ask them to write them down. You'll find that most of them can't remember more than 3 or 4. Then try the opposite. Ask students or teachers to listen to 10 5-syllable words for 1 minute. So you slowly say them, you can repeat them, and then ask them to write the words. Well, what will you find? Everybody at the beginning will have said, yes, I'm mostly a visual learner, or I'm mostly an auditory learner. But what you will find by conducting this little experiment yourself is that actually people don't know. And the reason this is important is because we sometimes confuse what people think are their learning styles with their preferences. And if it's just a preference, that's not good enough. And I taught many years in Hong Kong. I was in Hong Kong for 12 years. And my students would say, oh, Dr. Ken says, oh, we just like to listen. We don't like to speak in class. I said, nonsense. They said, that's not your learning style. That's just because you're lazy. You don't want to talk in class, but you have to. So we have to consider that. The sixth one is intelligence. How do we define intelligence in the second language classroom? In fact, we don't have to. Everybody learns a language. Everybody learns their first language, right? It doesn't matter how intelligent you are. So learning a language is not actually totally tied to intelligence. Everybody can do it. Of course, some people might be able to do it better, and some people might be able to do it faster, but it doesn't really make a difference. So here's a story. Actually, it's a story from England that another professor told me. And he said this mother was called into the school, and the teacher said to her, "Oh, Mrs. Smith, oh, I'm so sorry, but your son is too stupid to learn French." Right? What a thing to say! What a thing to say to a mother. Your son is too stupid to learn French. What did the mother say? Said, "Oh, that's okay. Just teach him whatever language stupid French children learn." So she recognized that actually intelligence isn't part of learning, and probably the real problem was with the teacher. So the seventh one has to do with autonomy. Now, this is one of the biggest challenges that we face, is how can students continue to learn on their own? And all of you, I know some of you have been teaching for 10, 20, maybe even 30, 40 years. But I bet none of your students from 20 years ago phone you up and say, "Oh, teacher, I forgot. How do I conjugate the copular verb?" Right? Nobody does that, right? Students don't phone you up 10 years later or 20 years later to ask you questions. They have to be able to learn on their own. And the only way they can have that autonomy, have that ability to learn on their own, is if we give them strategies that help them to do that. So we have to work with those strategies somehow to help those students learn. Okay, so now let's turn back to teenagers. Let's talk about teenagers. That's what you all came for. So here's the question. Did you used to be a teenager? Okay, well, I did, and I'm sure all of you did as well, unless we have some young children joining us today, but you used to be a teenager. And the interesting thing is, we think we know a lot about teenagers because we used to be one, just the same as we think we know a lot about students because we used to be one. But sometimes it's difficult for us to look back. And here's two pictures, me now and me when I was, probably 17 years old or something like that. I know I look exactly the same, right? Maybe not. Okay, what we're really interested in is, what does brain research tell us about teenagers? Not just what we remember, what we think, maybe what we have an idea about because we're teaching teenagers now, but what does some of the brain research teach us? And that's interesting because actually it's quite different from what we think. So I'd like to essentially today, in today's talk, go through 10 teenage brain facts. And I guarantee by the end of this, you're going to understand the teenage brain a little bit better. Okay, so first of all, and I think there will be many surprises here, is how do you define teenager? So this is my two teenagers. I have two sons, both teenagers now, 15 and 18 years old, both 1.9 meters tall. They're monsters. They're much taller than I am, and they're monsters. But But that's helped me to sort of understand some things about the teenage mind as well. And when I think about teenagers, of course, all of you are saying, well, a teenager, it's from 13 to 19. Well, it turns out that's not quite true. In fact, what the brain tells us is that the teenage brain continues to develop between the ages of 11 to 25. So this is from Nature and Neuroscience. And again, that's looking at the changes in the brain, the hormones, the development of the lobes in the brain, and how they develop. But the really, really interesting fact related to this is that development differs. We don't all develop at the same rate. Actually, girls start earlier. On average, their brain really starts to go from the child's brain to the teenage brain at age 11, and it continues until age 20. And by that time, their brains are thinking more like the adult brain. Well, what about boys? They start later, no surprise there. And boys, they start at age 12, and they continue with the teenage brain until, on average, the age of 25. Really? Are you kidding me? Well, actually, I think it probably makes sense for lots of people. When you look at 23-year-olds, 25-year-olds, the crazy things that they do, you say, oh, that makes sense. And for all the women in the audience today, I think you probably remember boyfriends who were 20 or to 25, something like that, and you think, oh my goodness, he behaves like a teenager. And all of a sudden, it makes sense. It has to do with the brain development. Now, 40% of teenagers in the world don't attend school. They miss out. And what exactly are they missing out from? Well, if they're not attending school, they have to be doing something else. And what is that something else? Well, they miss a lot of opportunities from school. Of course, adolescent learning comes from many places. It comes primarily from their peers. They like to learn from their peers. If their friends are doing it, they want to do it. They learn from home, and of course their siblings and their parents. That's very important to them. Distributed resources just simply refers to things like computers. So of course they're learning from computers and the internet, and students are spending so much time on the internet these days. I never see a student unless they're holding a phone. The next one has to do with work. So many of these students who are not in schools, they end up working, and so they're socialized through the work practices. They may have other communities, such as the church or the mosque or the temple, that they attend, and so that's going to make a difference as well. Other communities might be sports teams. But school has a very special way of giving something that the students need. It helps to socialize them, really to teach them how to behave with other students and other people in general, including adults, in a safe and easy environment, because they can they can react to teachers in a variety of different ways, and teachers are understanding. We are all psychologists. We are all looking at our students, trying to understand them, and realizing that they are not little adults. They are teenagers who are developing into little adults. I read something yesterday. It said that the teenage years are terrible because everyone treats you like a child but expects you to be an adult. And I think that's true. I think that's a difficulty. But the teachers understand the challenges a little bit more. So what do we do? And here I'm going to be using a few examples from Wider World. You can think about your own materials, your own examples, your own textbooks maybe that you use, and some might be similar, but the principles will be the same. So one really important thing that we have to do is to create pair work opportunities. So in this one it says, in pairs, use these questions to talk about your family. Then tell the class about your partner's family. Okay, it's a pretty simple task. But why is it important? It's important because when students are in pair work, first of all, they're going to be exercising their speaking and listening skills. Probably they're going to take some notes. So they're practicing their writing skills. Then they're going to read their notes. So they're doing reading, writing, listening, and speaking. So pair work, even though it just seems like the students are talking, are actually often an opportunity to practice all four skills. So when students are doing that, they're also socializing. Now, if you put them in a pair, and you can see from this activity, have you got any brothers or sisters? Students are often very shy. They often stay in their own little groups, and a new student has difficulty making friends. But this is the type of task which actually pushes them to meet and to engage with other people. Okay, let's go on to another brain fact. Number 2. Teenagers' brains are ready to learn, but they see themselves, the teenagers, and the world as unchanging. What does that mean? They don't expect that things will ever be different than they are right now, and they don't expect that they will be different when they are older. And with very young teenagers, they say, so do you have a girlfriend? They say, hate girls. No, girls are yucky. Or boys, or the girls will say the same thing about the boys or the other partners. Now, what's going on there? They must recognize that most people do get girlfriends and boyfriends, and they do marry, but they still can't imagine themselves being those people. So when they're very young, they can't do that. They often grab onto things like music or fashions, and they think, this is the coolest pants ever. I'm going to be wearing these pants forever, And when I was young, I remember I had long hair. You saw that in the picture. Now my hair is so short. But when I was young, a teenager, I remember thinking, oh yes, I have long hair. I'll always have long hair. So they have difficulty thinking that the world is going to change. What is the teacher's response? What do we do with that? We have to somehow convince them that the world does change, that things are going to be different. And one way we do that is by introducing culture. Now, it's a very, very sort of a tender or touchy sort of thing to do this, because what we have to do is we have to not just show them something completely different, but we have to take them from themselves and take a little step down to something different. So in this one, for example, you see this where it says, hi Michael, and he's talking about, I like listening to classical music. What? Really? Now, my kids, they listen to mostly rap, although they're starting to play some classical music on the piano. But this is a moving from what they are to opening up some new ideas. So we're always trying to move students, push them a little bit into their area of discomfort. So, of course, we're teaching about language, classical, we're teaching different genres. But mostly this is really about trying to get them to think outside of themselves a little bit differently. And this is really what Jack Richards wrote about in 1997. He said teaching typically involves many different things, but the one that I think is really important is preparing students for new learning. And we can't just tell students things anymore. We have to say, okay, this is why this is interesting, or this is why this is important, or what do you already know about this, and what can you tell us about this yourself? And then we can move on from there. I'm just going to stop for a moment and just remind you, if you have any questions about what I'm talking about today, you can use the chat function on your toolbar and add those questions, and we'll get to those questions at the end, so don't be shy. Any comments or suggestions you want to make, that's great too. Okay, so in this particular chapter, it's talking about, or section of a chapter, time for culture. So it talks about, again, activities, cultural activities, things that students like, things that they dislike. And again, as part of the socialization of the students, they say, oh, I like this. And somebody else says, oh, I like that too. Or they say, oh, I hate that. They say, oh, I hate that too. And then all of a sudden the students are bonding. So it's a great thing that we do through the materials. And again, this idea of taking them from what they know to something that they don't know. So if you say the word photography, they have a certain idea, and selfies is probably a big part of that. So that makes sense to them. The next one, with dance. Okay, so they've got a good idea about dance, the kind of dance that they do, But here we push them to something different. This is flamenco, traditional Spanish form of dancing. Music, okay, there's classical, and so they say, yeah, I mostly listen to rap or pop or rock or something else, but you're pushing them. And even with the example of cinema here, you can see what they're doing. Students, when they think cinema, they think about the movie that they just went to. But look at the perspective. It's about making a movie. So you're pushing the students' ideas about what they have to something new. And it's something we have to always do. A very important thing always to do is to make it personal. In some ways. So if you look at number 3 here, it says in pairs, make true sentences with the phrases below and the words in vocabulary A. So they give a couple examples. I think I'm a good actor. What about you? No, I'm not a great actor, but I'm not a bad maybe dancer or musician or writer or something else, right? So it gets them a chance to bring it back to themselves. So we start with the students, we go out into the wider world, and then we bring them back. We bring them back to themselves to talk about themselves. Okay, so there's a lot of different activities, and part of the idea is repetition so that they get the ideas and they're learning the grammar, they're learning the vocabulary, and they're learning the ideas all at the same time, but it's being reinforced. Okay, brain fact number 3. Let's move on. The teenage brain develops new thinking skills and the computational abilities of adults, but emotions interfere. So I know with my own sons, they're very sharp, they're very smart. You know, I'm trying to add something and I'm good at math. I used to teach math, but they're quicker, you know, they're fast. Their brain acts very, very quickly. I'm trying to remember something, they remember something very quickly. They can think of new ideas, but quite often their emotions interfere. So if they don't want to hear something that contradicts with their own ideas, their own opinions, they don't want to hear it. They make that clear. So there's 4 steps that we can go through in addressing this. One is to develop their thinking skills through having a skeptical approach. The second one is breaking down problems. The third one is searching for evidence. And the fourth one is maintaining a vigilant attitude towards personal biases. Now, this is based on some research, and I'm going to give you that reference in a minute. But let's look at each of these one at a time. So the first one is developing a skeptical approach to problem solving and decision making. Skeptical means questioning everything. And actually, teenagers are pretty good at asking questions, but too often they accept what they see as being the truth. So they look at a web page and say, no, I read that on the internet. Okay, right? Like the internet never lies. Of course, they have to have some other opinions. So this is a great activity. You can see this one right here. I love this, right? It says, just the first sentence, we look the same, but we don't like the same things. Okay. Well, hold on a second. If I'm skeptical, what am I going to say? I'm saying, hold on. You say you don't like the same things, but you wear your hair the same way. You say you don't like the same things, but you're wearing the same clothing, right? So there I might start challenging it. The rest of the passage goes on to talk about differences. But again, we have to have this skeptical way of thinking about things. Breaking down problems into their simplest outcomes. Now, this is something where it's a kind of a critical thinking strategy. And I remember I talked at the beginning about we need strategies. So this one is interesting. So dancing. When you say the word dancing, everybody has an idea. Well, oh yeah, I know what dancing is. If I say that word, you're thinking in your head and you have a picture or a movie going on in your head about dancing. But here this tries to introduce different kinds. Street dancing, and the second one, I don't know if I'm saying this right. Is it serok or kerok? I hadn't heard about that before, so I'm learning something new. Ballet and salsa, I know, but again, we're trying to build the student's schema by breaking down problems into their simplest things and then seeing alternatives. The third point is searching for evidence that is both supports and refutes or goes against a given conclusion. So this one's talking about couch potatoes. I don't know if you know this term. It means people who just sit watching TV on the couch like they were potatoes, just sitting there. So this is looking for evidence, and this is a little essay and gives you arguments in two directions. What are students couch potatoes, or are they not, right? So it goes through and it talks about the differences between students who, for example, spend more time on the internet. Right now, that's what's happening. Instead of just watching TV like the last generation, they tend to spend more time on the internet. So it's giving evidence. The fourth issue is maintaining a vigilant attitude towards their personal biases, assumptions, and values that may interfere with making an objective decision. So this means that, you know, we come into an argument or we come into a new idea with our own feelings quite often. And teenagers do this a lot. And they're always thinking, what do I think? And we have to force them to question what they think. And so again, just about what about you and your family? Asking questions so that they reflect. So again, these 4 points: develop a skeptical approach, break down problems, search for evidence, maintain a vigilant attitude towards personal bias. Now, the important thing here is we are not video machines. We are teachers. And what teachers do is we tailor the materials for our students. We teach our students in a way that understands their weaknesses and their strengths. And so we adapt materials. Now, these questions are not part of that task I just showed you, but it's something that you as a teacher can add. And in fact, you have to add. What about emotions? What about emotions? Well, emotions often interfere, as I said, and students will have a number of reactions because of their emotions. They will say, oh, that's impossible. It's because they're too proud to accept that they can't do it. Or it's risky, says experience. And that's because maybe they're a little shy. They don't want to try something because what if they fail? It's pointless, said reason. Maybe because they're bored or just they think, oh, what is this doing for me? And as teachers, we say, give it a try, whispered the heart. I love that expression. Okay, brain fact number 4. The teenage brain embraces risk, needing more stimulation than an adult brain. If you don't believe me, try going on a roller coaster with your teenagers. The teenagers are sitting there, oh yeah, this is okay, boring. And you're thinking, I'm so scared, right? In fact, because as adults, the risk, we're much more aware of it and we find it much more stressful. But for teenagers, they need more risk. They need more exciting things. And this is why they do so many crazy stuff. So the teacher's response is, how can we give students more stimulation, but we have to maintain a safe environment? So the question is, one way to think about this is, what are you afraid of? Now, if we had time, if we were all in a group, you could all tell me all the many things you were afraid of. Clowns, snakes, spiders, right? Different things. But actually, there's one thing that is the number one fear in survey after survey after survey. And that number one fear is public speaking. What? Really? Look at the other ones there. Blood, needles, drowning. Really? You would rather drown than give a talk in public speaking? It's really, or you would rather encounter a zombie than do public speaking? But it's true. This is done at Chapman University in the States. It was a survey that was done in, I think, 2014. So it's true. It comes up over and over again. So let's give that to them. Let's give students multiple opportunities to speak in a variety of formats. Give them pair work, give them group work, give them debates, panel discussions, town hall meetings, make them do presentations. These are high-risk activities for teenagers. You're comfortable because you're a teacher and you stand up in front of 30 or 60 students every day. But for many teenagers, that's a terrifying, risky thing to do. So let's push them towards that. We can also adapt activities to make them more stimulating. So, for example, I do a thing with groups. I say, oh, okay, everybody get into a group of 6 students. Okay, first group, okay, you're giving instructions to the group how to escape. because there's a volcano going. And the second one, there's a flood coming. The third one, there's a nuclear accident. The fourth one, there's an earthquake. The fifth one, there's aliens landing. You can think of all these different things, but it creates a sense of urgency. It adds risks. It makes them more interesting. The task could simply be about giving directions, but you can see how we add that and make it more interesting for students. We also have to start with students' lives. So think about the things that they're interested in. And I love this little activity. It just asks some questions about newspapers, radio, TV, and the internet. But the one that interests me is radio and TV. Why not get the students doing some of this stuff themselves, right? Why not get them acting, doing a little radio show, doing a little TV show? And this is the great thing about every student in the world having a phone now, because that phone is a video camera. That phone is an audio recorder, right? That phone takes photographs. And so you can actually ask students very simply to create media. And of course, the big advantage, if they do a little video, they can do it again and again and again until they're happy with it. They can watch it and check their pronunciation, their speed, their fluency, their diction, their vocabulary. They can do all of these things very, very simply. Okay, brain fact number 5. We still have 5 to go. Teenagers' anxiety increases as they develop their ability to think abstractly and to reflect on their roles. It's a very curious one. They start thinking at the teenage years about what other people are thinking. It's the first time. Young children don't think about what someone else is thinking. They just think about what they do, right? So a little kid comes home, he says, "Oh, I don't think Sally likes me." "Why? Oh, why do you think she doesn't like me?" "I like you." He says, "Oh, she hit me with a stick." Okay, maybe she doesn't. But at the teenage years, say, "Oh, I don't think Sally likes me." "Oh, why do you say that?" "Oh, she looked at me funny," right? She looked at me funny. See, okay, they're imagining what's going on in somebody else's mind. Our teacher's response has to be to get students to challenge their inhibitions and build confidence in themselves by undertaking a range of social activities in the class. Now, we already talked about working in pairs, all the pedagogical advantages of that, but it also has to do with negotiation of meaning and scaffolded learning. These are 2 ways in which we learn. Negotiation of meaning is simply asking questions when you don't understand something and trying to get to the details. Scaffolded learning is when one person says one idea and somebody adds something new and something new and something new, like a ladder. You're climbing up a ladder together, helping each other learn new ideas. Same thing with working in groups. The only trouble is you need to have strategies to ensure all students are working. How do you do that? Well, a very simple way that I do is say, okay, groups, 6. Okay, number off. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, I will choose which number presents. Usually they say, "Oh, you're so good at English. You present," right, in the groups. But instead, we say 1, 2, 3. I'm going to choose number 3. And so all the number 3s have to stand up. Because they all think they have to present, they might have to present, they all have to be ready. Moreover, if it's for marks, they look at the weakest student in the group and they say, "Oh, let's make sure Eric really understands, and we'll give him some extra help there," right? So there's strategies you can use. Number 6, teenagers have difficulty interpreting emotions. They don't really understand sometimes when somebody is sad or angry, or they have difficulty recognizing actually emotions in other people. They also have difficulty following directions. And so one thing to do is to get students to think of and describe processes. Tell us about your day. What did you do in a day? What did you do first, second, third? How would you handle this problem? What would you do first, second, and third? And think about those sorts of processes. Relate the ideas, new ideas, to the ones that students know. So here's one about what are the best and worst things about your town. Why not say, where would I go in your town? How would I, tell me, give me a tour of your town. And again, tell me about, the things you really love and the things you really hate. And again, you can do that and personalize it about their own experience. And it goes back to what I said at the beginning. Students need to be able to talk about their own experiences, about their own culture. So that gives them that chance. And while they do that, give students a chance to explore emotions. And I love this task. For example, it says, Student A, you borrowed Student B's laptop, but you dropped it, and it stopped working. You have to apologize. So Student B is you don't accept Student A's apology. This is interesting, because always in books we see, I'm sorry I dropped it. That's okay. That's fine. Okay. And that's it. But this one, it's creating conflict, and they have to deal with the emotions in different ways. It's interesting. Okay, brain fact number 7. Teenagers' weakest reasoning skill is cause and effect. Really? I didn't believe this. Actually, the reason I know this is because at Simon Fraser University, I write a lot of textbooks, not the ones I'm talking about today, but I write a lot of other textbooks. And I have a Learning English for Academic Purposes textbook, a series of those, and they're using them at Simon Fraser University. And they said, oh, we need more cause and effect essays. It's the biggest problem for them. And I thought, no, that's nonsense. But then I did the research, and it's true. It's true. More than process essays or just definitions or descriptions or persuasive arguments, this is the one they really have difficulty with. So teenage students fail to see cause and effect relationships in terms of the consequences. What will happen next for actions when they wanted to do or that they are pressured into doing? So my mother, when I would do something stupid, I would say, oh, well, Andy was my best friend. Andy did it. He said, if Andy jumped off a cliff, would you jump off a cliff too? And I'm thinking to myself, yes, I probably would. I probably would do that, because that's how the teenage brain works. They don't see the problems. That's why they do so many risky behaviors as teenagers, drive crazy ways. They, take great chances and do silly things. So what do we do to teach cause and effect structure? Well, it's very simple. Show them a picture, and there's, any picture from a textbook, and say, what would happen next? What would happen if? So in this one, it looks like a car accident. You can see the front of her car is a little banged up. The guy's on the ground. What happens next? Say, oh, well, he goes to the hospital. What happens to the woman? Well, she goes to the police station. What happens if he lives? What happens if he dies? What happens if, the woman is charged? What happens if she's not? And then they start thinking about all the different cause and effect. This is one that I love from the textbook. Are you enjoying dance classes? Yes, I am. Mrs. Smith thinks school activities out-of-school activities are important. Her daughter Holly is always busy after school. She goes to dance classes every day at 5. She has an extra French class on Tuesdays, singing lessons on Wednesdays, and art classes on Thursday nights after her guitar lesson, right? So it says here, is she sleeping, right? She's so tired, she's fallen asleep in class. Her mother looks really tough. You're not trying very hard today. Holly usually has a lot of homework, but she practices the piano for 2 hours in the evening. She often goes to bed late at night. She doesn't look very happy, right? So again, we're seeing the cause and effect here. Holly also enjoys art at the weekend. So what kind of art does she enjoy? She's vandalizing, right? She's spray painting walls, right? Yes, Mom, I am painting, right? So it's her revenge against her mother. So you could explore this with cause and effect. So why is she like that? So asking those why questions of students will get you somewhere. So how can we explore cause and effect? Simply by asking more questions. Brain fact number 8. Teenagers experiment with emotions, trying them out on teachers, parents, and others. So, again, if you have teenagers, I don't have to explain this, but I remember when our sons were younger, something like that, say, oh, here's a cookie. Oh, mommy, I love you so much. Things like that. And say, oh, but it's raining, so we can't go to the park. I hate you. And these wild, strong emotions, really, they're trying them out they're trying them out on parents, and they try them out on teachers because they're not quite sure how they work, and so they're experimenting with them. So what do we do as teachers? Well, when should we address inappropriate emotions, and when should we just let them go? When should we say, okay, I'm just ignoring that right now. And how do we address emotions in the classroom? Well, sometimes you just have to step away and say, okay, nothing. We have to understand where they come from. And sometimes these emotions come out of frustration, and sometimes they come out of boredom. So frustration is when something is a task or a skill is too difficult. Boredom is when the task or the skill is too easy for the students. And we're always trying to find something in the middle that goes into a flow. Otherwise, what happens is we get defiant students who won't participate, or they're withdrawn, or they're compliant and they just do the minimum. Sometimes I think the worst is tactical. This is a student who says, teacher, will this be on the test? Right? You think, oh, is that the only reason you're here, is just to pass a test? You're supposed to be learning a language, right? And then you get into the intrinsic level, that lovely level where the students are self-motivated to learn. And that's what we really want to do. So in terms of the role play, that's one way we can explore emotions with students. So example from the book, in pairs role play the situations. Student A, look below. Student B, look at page 131. So they're really looking at some different issues there and some different directions. And of course, it's a conflict. So they have to deal with the emotions that are wrapped up in there. But by exploring those in role play, it's a safe way or a safe place for them to explore those emotions. Brain fact number 9. We've got 10 altogether. Teenagers are slow to develop empathy for others. What does this mean, empathy? Empathy means putting yourself in the place of another. Now, my older son, he's studying international economics, but I remember a couple of years ago talking to him, because he's always been interested in business and economics. He doesn't want to be a teacher like me. And he said, oh, poor people, they should get jobs. I said, well, not all poor people can get a job. Sometimes they have to support their children. They have to stay home to take care of their children. Children, they shouldn't have children if they don't have money, right? Okay, terrible. Unfortunately, he's grown out of that thinking. He's older now, but that's a typical teenager response. They can't put themselves in the place of other people. They can't imagine what it's like to be poor, or what it's like to, have children, or be out of work and do things like that, right? In general, we have to think about our textbooks carefully in terms of the models and everything that's in the textbook and how it relates to the students. We say that Moskowitz says that in foreign language teaching, we customarily begin with the lives of others with whom students may not easily identify. They're reading about somebody and they say, that's not me. And then expect the students to transfer the material to their own lives. However, transfer to the textbook is easier when the content starts with the student. So let's begin with the student. Let's begin with the student's interests, with their concerns, with their problems, with their ideas. Let's talk about all those things first, and then we can move on. And talk about the other materials in the book. So how do we do that? Well, we have to give phrases and ideas that are related to themselves and to their emotions. And you can see the key word on this page is I'm. I'm how to. I'm spending a lot of time. I'm not enjoying or enjoying. I'm feeling. I'm doing. I'm listening. Because students are egocentric. Their teenagers are egocentric. They think about themselves. They have a hard time thinking about anyone else. So, of course, you have to start with themselves. And then after a while, after they develop the language, we can expand that. Expand their interest and their empathy and their understanding for other people in this way. Okay. Brain fact number 10 is not a surprise to most people. Teenagers need more sleep. And you think, well, this isn't an educational issue. And in fact, it is. It's a huge educational issue. It's not only do teenagers need more sleeps, and sometimes 10 hours a night is not enough. Really, they do need a lot more sleep because their brain is developing. And because their brain is developing, it happens while they're sleeping. They take in all of these ideas during the day, and then at night when they're sleeping, they're processing them in their brains and making them work. And if we don't give them the opportunity to do that, if we don't give them the chance to process some of those ideas, and develop those into, to hardwire them in their brains. If they're always tired and always sleepy, then they won't learn. Learning won't take place. It just becomes an enormous problem. Well, what is the problem? Well, the problem is at night, teenagers have difficulty getting to sleep as early as other people. Their brain tells them to stay up later. In the morning, they have difficulty getting up. Their brain tells them to sleep. They want to stay sleeping. And, if getting a teenager up in the morning first thing is always challenging. So what could we do? Well, in fact, there was a school in New Jersey that tried a radical experiment. They understood this research about about teenagers' sleeping patterns. So at just this one school, they tried an experiment. Instead of starting school at 8 o'clock in the morning, they changed the hours, and they started school at 10 o'clock in the morning, and then classes went until 5 o'clock instead of 3 o'clock. So they completely changed the schedule. What happened? Well, they thought that actually students would just be more awake, and that would be one advantage. But they saw many advantages. First of all, things that were so unexpected. First of all, the students' scores, their academic scores, all went up. The entire school, their learning increased and their improvements. So they were understanding more, and they were able to demonstrate that understanding in assessments in a much better way. So that was wonderful. That was a great thing. What else happened? The next thing that happened was that the sports teams did better. The sports teams, because the students were more rested after school when they were playing their sports and competing against other teams, because they were better rested, they actually won. So right across, all their sports teams did better. The teachers found, and this is more difficult to measure, that the students were nicer. Because they weren't so tired, they were less irritable, and their homework was done more often. So they kept up with their homework, and they also just seemed to be more pleasant in class. But the one really startling fact is fewer accidents. Now, in this particular neighborhood, New Jersey is a very busy suburb of New York, and that's a state actually. But that area, you think, there's so many cars and things like that, but there were fewer accidents. People were actually not getting hit by cars or falling off their bicycles or anything else because they just weren't as tired, right? So what can we do as teachers? Well, we can't change the classroom's times. We can't, sort of say, yes, just come in at 10 o'clock. But motivation is a big thing that we have to do. We have to try harder to motivate the students. And of course, if we have very engaging materials, colorful, lots of action, very personal about the interests of the students, and I love this one about shopping because, of course, all students love to shop, it seems, then all of those ideas, it motivates the students more. But something else, just a very simple thing we need to do, is because we recognize that teenagers' rhythms are different, teachers should consider the times when they are most awake, and also be concerned about stimulants they may use to stay awake. So one big thing is don't give a test first thing in the morning, right? If you have a choice between giving a test at 8 o'clock or 11 o'clock, give it at 11 o'clock. The students will be more awake, and because they're more awake, they will perform better. Watch out if they're having Red Bull or Coca-Cola for breakfast. It's not going to help. It might wake them up in the short term, but then the sugar will hit, and they will have problems. Okay, so what do we know? At the beginning, I talked about these 7 points. It had to do with culture, first language, maturity, aptitude, intelligence, learning styles, and autonomy. In terms of the culture, just to rewind and talk about a couple ideas again, they need to learn about new cultures, but also they need to learn to talk about their own. So try to include both in the classroom so that they can describe their town, their city, their country, their history, their food, their culture. The second one is the first language. Try to anticipate what challenges they will have. Do they use a different alphabet, like the Cyrillic alphabet or something, or Chinese or Japanese? That's going to make it more challenging. But even with languages that are close to English, such as French and Spanish, you look for where will they have particular problems. Anticipate those and deal with them. Recognize that maturity is going to be different among the students, but that getting the students to work together in small groups and in pairs is probably the best defense, because then they see how their peers behave, and when they see their peers behaving better, then maybe they'll behave better. Their aptitude for learning a language is not is difficult to change, but we recognize that it has to do with attitude and skills. Improve the student's attitude by getting them more motivated and help them with skills through strategies. That's going to make a difference. In terms of intelligence, it really doesn't play into the language classroom. Some students may need more help. They may take longer to learn a language, but it doesn't mean they're not intelligent. It just might mean they're having some more challenges. And also, everyone learns a language. It's possible. So don't give up on students who have difficulty learning English. Learning styles are, in some ways we have to make sure, I do believe in certain people have certain learning styles, ways in which they learn better, but we have to make sure that we're not confusing learning styles with learning preferences. Just because the students don't want to speak doesn't mean they're visual or auditory learners. They have to speak. They have to work in class. And finally, autonomy, the ability to work on your own. Students need strategies to prepare them so that they can go out and continue their language educations for the rest of their lives. Just in summary, teenagers stand between childhood and adulthood, and they can best make that transition from childhood to adulthood with the support of teachers who try to understand them, address their needs. So I'm Dr. Ken Beatty. Thank you very, very much for joining us today. I have a website, kenbeatty.ca, CA for Canada. And also, just a reminder, I'm giving another talk that's coming up on Saturday. If you enjoyed this one, I'm going to be talking about interactivity on Saturday, and that's at the same time, starting at 4 o'clock British Standard Time, or 8 o'clock where I am, outside of Vancouver, at Pacific Standard Time. If you have any questions or would like to register, you can go to www.pearsonelt.com. I haven't seen any questions in the chat line. If you have any questions now, you can do that.
Thanks, Ken. Number 3, in fact, I think people were very keen on this part of the presentation, so I think it would be good to hear some of it again. Could you give advice on how to involve teenagers in project work? Only 10% of my students take part in this type of activity. I try to offer interesting topics, but students are still passive.
Yeah. Okay, so what I'm hearing there is I try to offer interesting topics. And bless your heart, teachers work so hard, they work too hard. And instead, flip the paradigm. Say, okay, you have to do a project. How are you going to show me that you know this, right? So you shift it back to the students. Say, not my problem, right? So with my own graduate students, I teach graduate and doctoral students, I use the same approach. I say, okay, we've been studying, grammar. I want all of you to take a different grammar point, and I gave them one task. I say, I want you to design an app that would be great for teaching that grammar point. You don't have to build the app. You just have to describe what it's going to look like. Pictures would, some big drawings or pictures would be helpful, maybe a process chart, whatever. But you decide, right? So I push it back to them and say, oh, teacher, first question. They say, what if I do the same one as the other students? Not my problem, right? You figure it out. So all of a sudden, what am I doing? I'm forcing all the students to talk to each other. They each have to talk to each other to figure out what everybody else is doing. It changes it from a competitive classroom to a collaborative classroom, because then they're saying, oh, what's your ideas? Oh, I could maybe use some of that as well. Instead of a competitive classroom in which we give every student the same topics, and then what happens? They think that they're competing against each other. And when people are competing, the strong ones think, I'm going to win. And they're very motivated. But the weak ones think, oh, there's no way I can win. I'm just giving up. And that's what often happens with students, is they give up because they think they can't compete. But when you push it back to them and say, you choose the topic, you choose the way you're going to present it, just let me know, I'm just going to approve it. And also, I want you to check to make sure nobody else is doing the same thing, right? Because I don't want to, honestly, I don't want to listen to 10 presentations about Big Ben or the Queen or something like that. I want them all to be different for myself, because the other that happens there is that I have 10 groups presenting on 10 topics. They're all educating each other. If you have 10 groups presenting on the same topic, it's boring. It's boring for you. It's boring for the students. So mix it up and make it the student's problem. That's my big advice. Any other questions? Yeah?
I can, yes, a couple more, and then anything that we haven't answered we'll deal with offline.
Okay.
Have you had any experience of using a mentor or buddy system in classes for weaker or strong students?
Yes, yes. And I actually, if you go onto YouTube and just search Ken Beatty, Mixed Ability Classrooms, I talk about this. So yes, I have. And I can tell you the secret to it. Now, in most cases, we always have mixed ability classrooms with some stronger students and some weaker students. So there's, it just makes sense for us as a teacher to put the stronger ones and the weaker ones to work together, hoping that the stronger ones will mentor or help the weaker ones. There's just one problem here. The stronger ones hate it. They hate it because they think, hey, I know this stuff. I'm just going to go downhill. It's not going to improve my mark to be helping somebody else. Why am I doing this, right? It's extra work. You're the teacher. You should be helping him. All of this is mistaken. All of this is mistaken thinking, because as teachers, the way you learn the most is by teaching somebody else. So it's just a simple matter of going to the better students first, taking them aside and say, listen, I know you're good at this. I know you already know this, and so you don't even have to study it anymore. But what I really need is to help the other students to do something. So I tell you what, I'm giving you a great mark already, but I want you to work with the other student and see if you can bring their mark up. And just doing that in some way, all of a sudden changes their attitude, because they think, okay, I'm going to learn more because I'm teaching, but also the teacher recognizes that I'm good, and this is not a punishment. And too often the mentors see it as a punishment to be put with a weaker student. So that's part of the issue where it breaks down in some cases. So the weaker students, of course, they benefit, but they also have to say, you also have to talk to them and say, this is an opportunity. You're good at many things, but maybe you could be a little bit better. So I'm just going to have you work with this person this time. I just like to say one other thing that's related to this is students who are not as good get that impression about themselves very quickly. They think, I am not good at English, or I'm not good at learning, I'm not good at something else. So I have a trick. I have a great trick that I use with my own students, my own graduate students. Now I teach internationally. I have students from, usually in a class, I might have master students from 11 different countries or 12 different countries. Very common. So if that's the case, of course, most of them, half of them, English is their second language. They're struggling a little bit to do things, and they're not perfect. They're not stupid. They're very bright, but their English is not perfect. So what do? I have a little trick that I do at the end of every assignment. When I mark the assignments, I go through the assignments and I look for one thing that the worst students have done. One thing that's good. It could be the title, could be the introduction or the conclusion of their paper, it could be the way they formatted a table, could be anything. But I take that one thing out and I put it into a little PowerPoint and I say, okay, instead of talking about the worst papers or the worst mistakes or the mistakes you made, I want to share with you what are the 10 best things that I've seen in this class so far? And then all of a sudden, this student who's a terrible student is sitting at the back and they say, yes, and Robert puts his head up, me? I said, Robert did this really great title. I love this title. And I talk about it a little bit, right? It's interesting psychologically what it does for that student. It makes them think, oh, actually, I can do some things very, very well. And maybe I can share that. I was just in Seattle at TESOL, and I was using another example of something related to this. And we're talking about a chess game, and the materials had playing chess in it. And I said, in your class, ask your students, who plays chess? Now, probably half the students will put up their hands. But again, take the weakest student and say, or two weakest students and say, okay, you guys, can you bring a chessboard in tomorrow and just show us how chess works? Because half the class doesn't know how to play. All of a sudden, you've given the weakest students a good job to do, and they're going to feel like they're contributing to the class. So again, our job is not just to treat the best students and take care of the best students. Our job is to take care of the weakest ones, and that's the most important job that we do. Yeah? Okay. And another question?
Actually, I think we'll get back to everyone else offline if that's okay, Ken. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Okay, thank you all so much for coming. This is the great thing about our profession is we are a learning culture. We never stop learning as teachers, and I appreciate all of you taking the time out of your busy schedules to come and join us today. And I look forward to seeing many of you on Saturday for another session. Okay.